This video is part 3 of chapter 16, and in this video we're going to look at somatic sensory pathways. Somatic sensory pathways relay information from the somatic sensory receptors that we just looked at to the primary somatosensory area in the cerebral cortex and to the cerebellum. The pathway for the somatic sensory pathways involves first order, second order, and third order neurons. First order neurons, these are going to be the neurons that conduct impulses from the somatic receptors into the brainstem or the spinal cord. From the face, mouth, teeth, and eyes, somatic sensory impulses will propagate along cranial nerves into the brainstem. So it's a little bit different depending on which area of the body those sensory impulses are coming from. Because from the neck, trunk, and limbs, and also the posterior aspect of the head, you have somatic sensory impulses that will propagate along the spinal nerves to the spinal cord. Second order neurons, these conduct impulses from the brainstem and spinal cord to the thalamus. So axons of the second order neurons decussate in the brainstem or also in the spinal cord. So decussate, this literally means to cross over to the opposite side. So the second order neuron axons, they will decussate in the brainstem or in the spinal cord, and that is before they ascend to the ventral posterior nucleus of the thalamus. All somatic sensory information from one side of the body reaches the thalamus on the opposite side. Lastly, we have the third order neurons, and these actually conduct impulses from the thalamus to the primary somatosensory area on the cortex on the same side. Somatic sensory impulses ascend to the cerebral cortex by 3 general pathways. The first one is the posterior column medial lemniscus pathway. The second one, this one is going to be the anterolateral pathway, also called the spinothalamic pathway. And then the third somatic sensory pathway is going to be the trigeminal thalamic pathway. First, we're going to talk about the posterior column medial lemniscus pathway. So this pathway conducts impulses for touch, pressure, vibration, and conscious proprioception. So touch, pressure, vibration, and conscious proprioception. And these sensations coming from the limbs, trunk, neck, and posterior head. Here we have the posterior column medial lemniscus pathway, and its name actually comes from the names of the 2 white matter tracts that convey the impulses. So this is going to be the posterior column of the spinal cord and the medial lemniscus of the brainstem. First order neurons will extend from the sensory receptors in the limbs, trunk, neck, and posterior head into the spinal cord. So you can see here they're going to come into the spinal cord here, and they're going to ascend to the medulla oblongata on the same side of the body that they come in from. Now, the cell bodies of these first order neurons, remember, are in the posterior dorsal root ganglia. So right here and right here, these are both going to be the posterior dorsal root ganglia of those respective spinal nerves. In the spinal cord, their axons will form the posterior dorsal columns. So that's going to be those posterior columns. And there are two parts of the posterior column: the gracile fasciculus, which is going to be the more medial aspect on either side of the posterior column, and also the cuneate fasciculus, which is going to be the more lateral aspect on either side. So we're going to have this more medial aspect is going to be the gracile fasciculus, and then the cuneate fasciculus on either side of the spinal cord. Now, as these sensory axons go up the same side of the spinal cord, their axons will synapse with dendrites of the second order neurons as they go up, and these second order neurons have their cell bodies in the gracile nucleus or the cuneate nucleus in the medulla. So those are going to be right here. We have the gracile nucleus and the cuneate nucleus, and this is in the medulla. So just like in the posterior column, the gracile nucleus is going to be the more medial one, again on either side of the central nervous system, I guess in this case, on either side of the medulla. And the cuneate nucleus is going to be the more lateral aspect. And you can actually see those cell bodies of the second order neurons right here. This little black dot here, going to be those cell bodies of the second order neurons. Now this part is also important as well. The upper limbs, the upper trunk, the neck, and the posterior head will travel up the cuneate fasciculus, so right here, the more lateral one, and go to the cuneate nucleus. I'll erase these here. The cuneate nucleus, and then this is where they're going to cross over. On the other hand, the sensory information from the lower limbs and the lower trunk will travel up through the gracile fasciculus and up to the gracile nucleus where they cross over. So the axons of the second order neurons, not the first order, but the second order neurons, after they synapse, or after the first order neurons synapse with the second order neurons, those axons of the second order neurons will cross to the opposite side of the medulla, and that's when they will enter the medial lemniscus. So that's going to be right here. This is the medial lemniscus in the midbrain. In the thalamus, so these axons will travel up, go to the thalamus, and in the thalamus, the axon terminals of the second order neurons will synapse with third order neurons. So you can see here, so they will stay on the same side. So after they cross over here in the medulla, then they stay on the same side of the central nervous system. They will synapse in the thalamus with third order neurons. And then those third order neurons will project their axons to the primary somatosensory area of the cerebral cortex. Let's see here. Nerve impulses for pain, temperature, itch, and tickling from the limbs, the trunk, the neck, and the posterior head will all ascend to the cerebral cortex along the spinal thalamic pathway, or the anterior lateral pathway. So just like the posterior column medial lemniscus pathway, the spinal thalamic pathway is also composed of a 3-neuron set. So here we have the spinal thalamic pathway. Okay, so the first order neurons connect a receptor of the limbs, trunk, neck, or the posterior head with the spinal cord. So we have these incoming receptor neurons there. And the cell bodies of the first order neurons are in the posterior root ganglion, just like in the last time. Remember, this is the posterior or the dorsal root ganglion. It's the same name there. And these axon terminals of the first order neurons will then synapse with the second order neurons, whose cell bodies are going to be in the posterior gray horn of the spinal cord. So that's where the cell bodies of the second order neurons are. So it's a lot different than the last pathway that we looked at. Now, axons of these second order neurons will actually cross to the opposite side of the spinal cord, right where they enter. So these first order neurons will enter the spinal cord, synapse with the second order, and at that same level in the spinal cord, those second order neurons will decussate. Now the axons of the second order neurons will then pass upward to the brainstem by the spinal thalamic tract. So that's where this one gets its names. This is the spinal thalamic tract. The axons of the second order neurons will then end in the ventral posterior nucleus of the thalamus. So this one is a very particular area of the thalamus that these neurons will synapse in. And this is where they synapse with those third order neurons. The axons of the third order neurons then project to the primary somatosensory area on the same side of the cerebral cortex as the thalamus, or as the part of the thalamus that they synapsed in. Nerve impulses for most somatic sensations in the face, nasal cavity, oral cavity, and teeth ascend to the cerebral cortex along the trigeminal thalamic pathway. So like the other somatosensory pathways, this one also has 3 neuron sets in its pathway. First order neurons extend from somatic sensory receptors in the face, nasal cavity, oral cavity, and teeth through the trigeminal nerve. Just going to be this nerve right here. The cell bodies of these first order neurons are actually found within the trigeminal ganglion, as you can see right here. And the axon terminals of some of those first order neurons will synapse with second order neurons in the pons. So the trigeminal nerve comes into the pons, and some of those first order neurons will actually synapse with second order neurons in the pons. And other first order neurons descend their axons into the medulla and will actually synapse with second order neurons there. And the axons of the second order neurons will cross to the opposite side of the pons and of the medulla, and then they will ascend by the trigeminal thalamic tract. And then just like the other 2 pathways, the second order neurons will ascend to the ventral posterior nucleus in the thalamus on the same side, where they will synapse with third order neurons, and those third order neurons will project their axons into the primary somatosensory area of the cerebral cortex, which is on the same side that they synapsed with those second order neurons. Specific areas of the cerebral cortex receive somatic sensory input from particular areas of the body. And other areas of the cerebral cortex provide output in the form of instructions for movement of particular parts of the body. The somatic sensory map and the somatic motor map will actually relate parts of the body to these specific cortical areas. So here we have a somatic sensory map, and this is a precise localization of somatic sensations that occurs when those nerve impulses arrive at the primary somatosensory area. So remember, the primary somatosensory area occupies the post-central gyri of the parietal lobes in the cerebral cortex. So each of these regions in this area receives sensory input from a different part of the body. So here you can see we have the lips are going to be in this input to this area of the primary somatosensory area. We're going to have like the wrist input's going to come into this area of the primary somatosensory area, so on and so forth. Now you can see that there's actually quite different relative sizes. So this hand is quite large compared to this foot, for example. So what do these relative sizes mean? And the size of these regions relative to one another is actually proportional to the number of specialized sensory receptors within the corresponding part of the body. So what this is saying is that the lips have a very high density of specialized sensory receptors, especially compared to the teeth, the gums, and the jaw, or compared to the elbow. And the hand also has quite a bit as well. Two tracts in the spinal cord, the posterior spinal cerebellar tract and the anterior spinal cerebellar tract. These are the major routes of proprioceptive impulses that reach the cerebellum. Although these are not consciously perceived, sensory impulses conveyed to the cerebellum along these two pathways are very critical for balance and posture, and also for coordination of skilled movements like walking. So we've discussed all of these already, but this is a really nice table that kind of summarizes all of these major somatic sensory pathways. And it gives a really nice picture of where they're found in the spinal cord or the brainstem. So remember here the posterior column, this consists of the cuneate fasciculus and the gracile fasciculus. The spinal thalamic pathway conveys impulses for temperature, itch, pain, and tickling. The trigeminal thalamic pathway, this conveys nerve impulses for touch, pressure, vibration, and other sensations from the face, nasal cavity, oral cavity, and teeth. And then here we actually have a nice picture of the anterior and posterior spinal cerebellar pathways. And remember, these convey nerve impulses for proprioception in the trunk and the lower limbs. And that's going to be the end of Chapter 16, Part 3.